Well, it's great to see so many people on a Monday night, rainy Monday night. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And we're very delighted to have with us journalist David Leonhardt, who's here to talk about his new book, Ours Was the Shining Future, the story of the American dream. David, as I'm sure many of you know, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning senior writer for the New York Times, where he's worked for 24 years in various capacities, including Washington bureau chief, op-ed columnist, and staff writer for the Times Magazine. These days, he produces the paper's daily newsletter, The Morning, and also writes for Sunday Review. This book is David's first, and in it, he examines what's become of the American dream. That's a phrase that dates back to the Great Depression and represents the promise of being able to rise above the circumstances of one's birth and achieve a happier, healthier, and more prosperous future. That dream, as David recounts, has faded for many, many people in recent decades amid widening economic inequality, stagnating living standards, even a plateauing in average life expectancy in the United States. Looking at the factors responsible for what he calls the Great American Stagnation, David delves into a range of things: the decline of labor unions, a reduction in public investment, a move away from a somewhat regulated capitalism toward a more individualistic and market-centered version. He's particularly critical of the Democratic Party, which he argues has abandoned the working class and embraced issues that have alienated particularly working class whites, such as identity politics. Now, David himself readily admits to holding socially liberal views. And in his book, after diagnosing the problem, he does offer a hopeful way forward. In brief, he argues for progressivism that is, in his words, more inclusive of people who are not white-collar professionals. While talk of the vanishing American dream may sound familiar, David, as Publishers Weekly said in a review of his book, quote, makes it fresh with trenchant, quantitative analysis and an unusually sharp account of the left's culpability. The Washington Post called the book, quote, rich with historical details and resonant narratives. Speaking of the Post, we're privileged to have one of the paper's stars moderating this evening's discussion. Ruth Marcus has been with the Post nearly 40 years and has spent the past 2 decades on the paper's editorial board, where she now serves as an associate editor and columnist. And if you don't read her columns, you're missing out on some of the most incisive commentary there is about the Supreme Court and other subjects. And Ruth also, 4 years ago, came out with a book called Supreme Ambition about Brett Kavanaugh, and I would recommend that as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David Leonhardt and Ruth Marcus.
To sit on your mic. I guess I'll go first since I'm the questioner. Thank you, Brad. It's always nice to be at Politics and Prose, but it's especially nice to be at Politics and Prose on a rainy Monday night because Brad and Lissa are old friends of mine from Post days, and I've known David for long enough that I can say he's an old friend of mine also. I've known him since he was a college student. And we met at a Yale Daily News banquet, and I thought he had a shining future, actually, then. And it turned out that I was right, and so I'm so tickled. And this is your first book, David, and I want to say I'm just felling over it. It was so worth the wait. This to me is a compilation of points that you've been making and themes that you've been touching on and arguments that you've been refining for decades now. But it's really, some of us write books about individuals, and some of us write books about historical events or current events. But you've written a book about a very big topic in tackling the American dream, and you've done it with intellectual honesty, but also bringing to it, and this is everybody here needs to buy the book because you'll understand what I'm talking about. You've also done it with what I would call artistry, because I knew that a Leonhardt book would have charts in it and would have numbers that were conveyed in a way that even I could understand them. But I didn't know that you were going to have characters that were going to really bring it to life. And I would like to find the first page of this. Yes. And so I'm hoping now that I've buttered you up, that you could talk a little bit about how you decided to write the book, finally. I gather it might have taken a little bit of time.
It did.
And tell us where the title comes from, because, and when the title came, by the way, because did it come later in the process, or did you know from early on that that was what the title was going to be?
Yes, I would love to answer that. And first of all, it's just such a joy to be here. Thank you, Ruth, for doing this. Ruth has been a friend and mentor to me for so long. Ruth was the honored guest speaker at the college newspaper banquet that she just referred to when she was a young star reporter for the Washington Post, and she brought her boyfriend as her date.
He's right over there.
He's since been promoted.
Kept him.
And this is my home bookstore. I've sat in Ruth's chair many times. This is an amazing local institution. We're all so lucky to have it, and it's a real thrill for me to be here talking about my own book, and I see so many friendly faces in the audience, so thank you all for being here. Yes, the book started a long time ago, and this really is the topic to which I've devoted my career. And my views have not been constant about them throughout my career. I started as a journalist in the mid-1990s, and I think it was reasonable to be somewhat more optimistic about the state of the American economy in the 1990s, and about this idea that the economy we built, a more market-centric economy than almost any other rich country, I think it was reasonable to think that that was working at the time. But with the benefit now of 40 or 50 years of history, we see that actually the 1990s were a brief moment when it seemed to be working. And actually, for the vast majority of the last 40 or 50 years, incomes for most Americans have been growing more slowly than the economy. Wealth has been growing even more slowly. And you asked a specific question about the title. I am not good at naming things.
Not a headline writer?
I'm not a headline writer. I like my children's names very much, but I mostly just said that sounds good about them. And so at the New York Times, I co-founded this department called The Upshot. I knew I would not be the one to name it, and I offered a bribe of a very nice bottle of champagne to whoever at the New York Times would name it. So from the very beginning, I said to Random House, I'm not going to be able to name this book. I won't be good at it. And the combination of my Random House editors and my agent came up with the title. And it is a riff on the last line of the book that founded the term The American Dream. The American Dream comes from a 1931 book called The Epic of America by a historian named James Truslow Adams. Before that, the words American and dream sometimes appeared next to each other in newspapers, but it was almost accidental. It's not what we mean now. And he coined the phrase, and he described the American dream as the United States' most important contribution to the world, and he described it as that American dream of a better, richer, happier life for all of our citizens of every rank. And he wrote this book in 1931. I mean, that's audaciously optimistic to talk about the American dream in 1931. And I think it's a reminder that we shouldn't get too down about what our capabilities are as a country, even during dark times. He ended his book by quoting an immigrant from Russia named Mary Anton, who had written her own book. She had escaped anti-Semitism in Russia. She arrived in the United States knowing no English. And in her own memoir, she is sitting on the steps of the Boston Public Library, looking up at this grand public institution, and she says, "Mine is the shining future." And so Random House and my agent, Random House first suggested Ours is the Shining Future. My agent edited it to Ours was the Shining Future. And as Ruth knows, the subtitle was originally, in fact, if you have an advanced galley, you can still see this, was originally The Rise and Fall of the American Dream. And I was never totally comfortable with that. It was a little more pessimistic than I am. I actually end on an optimistic note. And but I didn't mention it to Random House until the very, very end. And at the very end, I asked, is it too late to change the subtitle? And they shocked and delighted me by saying no. And so that's why the subtitle is the more neutral, The Story of the American Dream. I do not want to suggest that that story is over, because I don't believe it is.
I want to get into all of that and dive into the argument of the book, but I actually wanted to start with a almost technical question about I mentioned that you brought in figures into this book that I didn't think when I picked it up, and I have the old galleys with the old subtitle, which I kind of liked, I have to say. I didn't expect they were going to be there. You meet Robert Bork, you meet Willa Cather, you meet Howard Jarvis, you meet Frances Perkins. How did you decide to incorporate those figures into your book, and did they come to you or did you come to them? And this is what I mean by that. Did you go out looking for avatars of the point that you wanted to make, or did you just in your readings come across figures who you thought really embodied, or that you already knew of, that embodied the points that you wanted to make? And as you describe that, maybe you would tell us about one or two of your favorite of these figures that you share with us.
Absolutely. I mean, people like stories, right? I mean, stories are better than numbers, quite frankly. My colleague, Nick Kristof, says that a single good story can persuade someone much better than a flurry of statistics. And we're human beings. Human beings have been telling stories forever. And one of the things, as much as I like math, I was actually a math major in college. You can guess how good at it I was by the fact that I became a journalist. I like numbers, but I think most journalism that uses numbers uses too many numbers. I think less is more when it comes to numbers. People focus on the numbers. And so I really wanted to write the kind of book that I like reading. And I don't read economic textbooks at night. I read history and I read novels and stories. And so what I did often is I dug into each of the main themes that I wanted to explore and make an argument about. And I looked for two kinds of stories, either stories that were largely unknown. Chapter 1 tells the story of a trucker strike in Minneapolis in 1934. It is much less famous than the Flint sit-down strike, which I didn't want to tell that story because it's so well known. And I was in Minnesota doing research on this strike, and I would run into people who are involved in politics, people involved in Democratic Party politics who know people in labor unions. And I would say, I'm here to research the great 1934 Teamsters strike. And people would say, never heard of that. And I thought, this is a good story to tell. And then the other kind of story I wanted to tell is I wanted to take people who actually are quite familiar, but I think their economic importance is sometimes overlooked. Robert Bork is obviously famous, but I don't think people understand quite his why he's so economically important. Grace Hopper, a computer scientist, arguably belongs in the first category, but I think she's a really nice avatar of mid-century American investment. And you just asked me to tell one story, so I'll briefly tell. One of my favorite chapters is chapter 4, and I tell the story of a preacher's son from Jacksonville, Florida, named Asa Randolph, who grew up there in the early 20th century, and his parents were not very well educated. They were quite poor, but they insisted that their two boys read. His mother insisted that they read out on the porch. They read the Bible because his dad was a preacher. They read American and African history. They read Darwin. They read Jane Austen. And growing up in Jacksonville, he was surrounded by segregation, and he wanted to escape it. And he moved north to New York, and he took night classes at City College. And he began as a soapbox orator in Harlem during the Renaissance. And then he became a writer. And when he became a writer, he decided that Asa Randolph was not a sufficiently august byline. So he used a version of his full name, which will be more familiar to many of you, A. Philip Randolph. And he soon became an organizer for the underdog labor union of all labor unions, porters and maids who are almost all black, working on the Pullman Railroad, which was one of the most powerful companies in the world, had J.P. Morgan, the person, not the company, on the board. And yet he somehow, and we can talk more about it if you want, somehow designed this incredibly successful strategy to organize these workers. And it was the first important black union in the United States. And even before the civil rights movement, the unionization of black workers in the 40s and 50s helped shrink the life expectancy gap between whites and blacks. It helps shrink the white wage gap between whites and blacks. And I like A. Philip Randolph so much as a character because many of us have heard his name, but we think of him as a civil rights activist rather than a labor activist. In fact, he was both, and his civil rights activism came from his labor activism. And I understand why Americans are so just pessimistic and down today. But if A. Philip Randolph didn't respond to the odds he faced by giving up, I don't think Americans should give up today.
And I'm going to jump to something I was going to ask you way later, but since you raised the role of labor and unions, and since I think we just have a settlement in the auto workers strike, one of the things that is striking, pardon the repetition of that word, in the book is the importance that you put on unions and the role of labor unions, including the role of labor unions going forward. And so I'm wondering, talk about that a little bit, and do you take lessons of hopefulness for the labor movement away from this strike, or is that a sort of unique and not necessarily significant moment for the broader question, given the problems that labor is facing today?
Yeah, what's the improv comedy? Yes, and? Is that what you're supposed to do in improv comedy? So yeah, to be a little bit self-critical, I mean, I've been writing about economics now for more than 20 years, and I don't think I've written enough about labor unions. I just think they're vital for particularly working class, blue-collar workers making a decent living. The empirical research on this is incredibly strong. I think the logic is often quite strong, right? If you imagine a big company being able to negotiate against an individual worker as opposed to workers banding together and having more leverage and bargaining power. I've been in a union. I've found it extremely frustrating at times. I've been a manager at the New York Times, and I've found the union's, let's say, reticence to change to be frustrating. So I'm well aware that unions are imperfect, but the way I would think about it is corporations are imperfect too. And if you have imperfect corporations not checked by imperfect unions, you have a terrible power imbalance. You have the economy we had in this country in the first couple decades of the 20th century, and the economy we've had in the first couple decades of the 21st century of really high inequality. I just think labor unions are vital. I think this settlement also shows how important they are. The auto workers won nice raises. They didn't win huge raises. When they've been reported in the media, we report what the wage increase is going to be by the end of the contract in 2028. That's 4.5 years away. You have to think about inflation, 3% a year over that time, probably. Could be 2%, could be 4%. It's about a 10% raise for these workers by the time the contract's done. But that's a meaningful raise. And the executives of these car companies have gotten much bigger raises than that over recent years. And the Detroit auto workers wouldn't have gotten raises by asking nicely. They got the raises because the companies understood that they were going to go on strike, and in some cases were going on strike, and were going to disrupt operations. And this is how workers get raises often. And so in the one hand, I take it as a cause for some optimism. However, I don't think we can have a turning point in terms of organized labor without a change in policy.
That means a change in law, right?
That means a change in labor law. And Brad mentioned that I'm critical of the Democratic Party in parts of this book. I'm also critical of the Republican Party. But when you go back and look at the Democratic Party, when they've had the ability to legislate under LBJ, under Jimmy Carter, at the beginning of Bill Clinton's presidency, at the beginning of Barack Obama's and Joe Biden's presidency, they've all said that they want to change the law to make it easier for workers to join unions. Right now, when workers try to join unions, if they're not already unionized, companies can pretty easily just kind of get rid of the unions, right? Starbucks is doing it now. They discover violations by the union organizers. They schedule the union organizers for shifts that start at 5:30 in the morning. They do all kinds of things to make it impossible. You need labor law to make it easier for workers to join unions. LBJ got nearly all of his Great Society agenda passed except labor law reform. Jimmy Carter had to choose between making the Panama Canal Treaty a priority and making labor law reform a priority. He chose the Panama Canal Treaty. Barack Obama said he was in favor of labor law reform. It didn't happen. Joe Biden said he's going to be the most pro-union president in decades, and in many ways he has been. He also didn't get labor law reform passed. And I don't mean to just blame the president, so oftentimes it's been Congress, but I don't think we're going to have a turning point until you have something that you had with healthcare and Barack Obama, or clean energy funding and Joe Biden, in which a Democrat runs for president saying, if I am elected, this will be one of my top 1 or 2 priorities, and then you get a Democratic Congress and it passes. There's a world in which you could imagine Republicans doing this, a bipartisan bill. That's a world I think many of us would rather live in. Marco Rubio has talked about the importance of labor unions. I just don't think that's the most likely way that we get it at this point.
So Brad did a actually quite wonderful job of summarizing your thesis, but I'll elaborate on it and ask you to elaborate further. You write, for almost half a century now, incomes and wealth have grown at a sluggish pace for most Americans, even as they have surged for the wealthy. Measures of public health have also stagnated. All in all, the United States is suffering through its worst period of stagnation in living standards since the Great Depression. I refer to it as the Great American Stagnation. Give us your capsule summary of why this has happened. And actually, I have to say, I'm a little bit taken aback by your reluctance to have the original subtitle stick, because I'm going to try to say this in the nicest possible
You don't
way.
have to.
I think that some of I read the book. I read every page of the book. The optimism that you end with, I think, is kind of necessary for our mental well-being, but I'm not sure I'm completely convinced by it.
That's totally fair. We're really going to get very nerdy and linguistic here. I also was slightly bothered by the existence of 3 different metaphors when we had rise and fall. So we had dream, rise and fall, and shining. And so I'm always trying to edit metaphors out of things at the New York Times, the idea that I would have 3 in the span of like 10 words. But in any event.
I liked it better when you said you didn't do the titles.
Okay, so the brief encapsulation. I think we can fight about economic statistics all day long. The overwhelming bulk of the evidence suggests that the last few decades have not been good for most Americans, right? You can draw the line. You can say it has not been good for the bottom 90% of earners, the bottom 60%. You could draw the line in different places. Some people say, well, actually, if you adjust for inflation in this different way, the last 50 years have really been wonderful for everyone. I don't buy that argument, and I think just on the merits, the economic argument is right. But if you're more agnostic than I am, I would argue there are 2 tiebreakers. Ask Americans how they feel about the economy and our society, and they're really grumpy about it. It has been almost 20 years since most Americans said our country was on the right track. Whether we have a Republican or a Democratic president, people say the country's on the wrong track. People are quite grumpy about the economy, almost no matter who the president is or whether the economy is growing or shrinking. There's huge amounts of frustration. And then to me, the absolute killer stat is that in 1980, the United States had a normal life expectancy, roughly average, for a rich country. It was a little better than some countries in Europe, but it was a little worse than others. Today, and for the last 15 years or so, we've had the worst life expectancy of any rich country in the world. Worse than every country in Western Europe, worse than Japan, worse than South Korea, worse than Canada and Australia. Our life expectancy is even lower than some countries that aren't rich. Slovenia, China, Chile. So it was not ever thus that we had the lowest living standard of rich countries. Instead, what happened is that life expectancy for many of those of us in this room has actually continued to be pretty good. It looks kind of like life expectancy in a European country. And life expectancy for people without a 4-year college degree has absolutely stagnated. And it's not just the last decades. It's not just opioids. They've played a bad role. But the trends start back in the 1980s. And so My basic thesis is that the fact that our political system has stopped trying to lift the living standards of most Americans. It's focused on other things. I think the Republican Party continues to pursue an economic policy that hasn't worked. In no way have we lived up to the promises that Ronald Reagan and the people he brought into office made. They said this will make the economy better for everyone. And I know they say, well, if only we'd tried their full version of things, it would have been great, which is also what Marxists say about their own economic ideas, right? I mean, we moved further toward the laissez-faire model than any other country, and the results have not been good. And the Democratic Party has really been increasingly focused on social issues that appeal to college graduates and has lost a lot of working class people, including in the last 5 years, Latino, Asian American, and Black working class voters. And so I think that is the fundamental reason why we are failing to deliver what people want. I think I answered both your questions.
You did. But I want to push you on something, which is you spend a lot of time, and appropriately so, and mostly I'm arguing with you for the sake of doing this, bemoaning income inequality. And income inequality is a big problem. Wealth inequality is a big problem. But you also acknowledged that we have dramatically improved living standards, that median household income is rising. And so if I have the standard of living that enables me to buy a house, and I know that's a big if for a lot of people, to send my kids to college, again, big if for a lot of people, why does the gulf, why does the fact that Mary Barra is making, what, $24 million a year at the head of GM, if GM can provide, you know, now, thank you, strike, living wage to its employees that allows them to have a decent life, is it really the inequality that is gnawing at people? Or is it something else? And do you want to plead guilty to paying too much attention to the inequality?
I think I think that's a very fair pushback. I think there's a theoretical world in which inequality is rising, but so are mass living standards at a nice rate. It's actually sort of the world we lived in from like 1996 to 1999. In which wages really...
That was short.
It was short. In which wages really weren't rising at a nice clip for most Americans, and inequality was also rising. But I think if you look at the full picture, it's not the case that living standards are really good and rising at a nice clip for most Americans, and they're rising even faster for the very rich. I think that's part of what the life expectancy data shows. I think it's part of the fact that we see a huge and rising divide between whether kids are growing up with two parents or not by class. We see a huge rising divide both by race and class about whether people spend part of their life behind bars, which is an absolutely horrible thing to have in your life. It affects, not only is it horrible in the moment, but it affects your prospects forever. The number of people who spend time behind bars, highly disproportionately Black and somewhat also disproportionately Latino people in recent decades has soared. And so when you look at what people say about their living standards, when you look at life expectancy, when you look at self-reported life happiness, I don't think we're living in the theoretical world in which things are going really well, but they're just going even more well for a small slice of people.
And I want to go back to the issues with the Democratic Party that you mentioned, and you borrow a striking phrase about the Brahmin left, and you talk about the simultaneous leftward shift or leftward focus on cultural issues of the kind of Brahmin left, the well-educated, college-educated class, and the defection of working class voters increasingly to the Republican Party. And you say that this Brahmin class has alienated many voters with increasingly liberal views on social issues. We've seen the Democratic Party readjust itself before. Readjusted itself, recalibrated with Bill Clinton. It recalibrated to a certain extent in nominating Joe Biden. How big a problem is this for the Democrats, and do you see now their capacity to address this question, or do you think there's a little bit that the capture might be too strong? And then I'm going to argue with myself after you answer.
Okay. I actually think Barack Obama did a lot of it as well, which we can talk about, of moderation on some of these issues.
That's also true, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, boy, go back and read Barack Obama's 2008 convention acceptance speech about how he talks about immigration, in which he both strongly asserts the need to treat people who are here decently, and strongly asserts the need for every country to have a border, in part to protect the most economically vulnerable people, both citizen and immigrant, who already live in this country. I don't know. I don't see a ton of evidence that the Democratic Party is grappling with this to the extent that it needs to. It is deeply ingrained in Joe Biden, very much so. I mean, Joe Biden won his first election in 1972 when the Democratic Party was getting wiped out with George McGovern as its nominee. And you go back and you read some of the things Biden said in the moment. And he, in 1972, understood the need to separate himself from this sort of more effete liberalism that was turning off working class voters. I don't see a huge sign. I think, look, this is a very hard subject to talk about, because what the Democratic Party often says is that this is all about racism. And the reason it's hard is a lot of it is about racism. I mean, Donald Trump says a lot of racist things, right? And what's hard about this is simultaneously saying, yes, the modern Republican Party has a long history of race baiting. And Donald Trump then said a lot of the quiet things out loud. A lot of the nasty and false stuff about immigrants also is steeped in racism. And what is really hard is both to say that and then also to say it's not all racism. Being in favor of reopening the economy more quickly than many liberals were has nothing to do with racism. It is very possible to believe in border security and believe that countries should have borders without being racist. In fact, I picked those two issues for a reason. When there was a study of Latino voters in Texas after 2020 to figure out why they shifted to the right and more of them voted for the Republican Party than the Democratic Party, the two issues that this study by a progressive research group named were immigration. Many Latinos thought the Democratic Party did not take border security seriously, which I think is a fair judgment of those voters. And two, many Latino voters were upset that Democrats wanted to continue lockdowns of schools and everything else forever and ever and ever. And so I think there are a long list of issues in which it is fair for people to have disagreements, but on the Democratic Party has created too long a list of issues in which it says, this isn't something over which reasonable people can disagree. This is something in which if you disagree with our position, you're either ignorant or you're hateful. And I think that is empirically wrong. I think there are many people who are not ignorant or hateful who hold socially moderate or conservative views. I also think it's really bad political strategy to go say to millions of people, you're ignorant and hateful, please vote for us. And that is too often what the party is doing.
So that is hard to disagree with. But I will push back on one thing, which is look at the abortion issue, which actually, much to my surprise, turned out after Dobbs to be much more politically salient for Democratic voters than it had ever been before, and did the trick for Democrats in the midterms, and Democrats hope it will do the trick for them again in 2024. So this feels like the counterexample, really, of your Democrats have focused too much on divisive social issues. Maybe abortion, because the polling has always been in favor of some degree of abortion rights, is the counter to that. And you make some interesting points about the ways in which Democrats should or should not talk about gay rights, for example. But I'm curious about how the abortion example fits into your scenario.
Yeah, so abortion is an issue in which the Republican Party has gone so far to the right and has been able to implement its policy agenda, as Ruth has chronicled, that that has turned off voters. So voters actually, basically a majority of voters want really significant abortion access, but not complete abortion access. And so it's possible to either get to the right or the left of the country. The Republican Party has gotten way to the right of the country, right? And honestly, they've gotten to the right of where many Republicans are. I mean, you look at Republican politicians and activists, and actually when someone in their own family needs an abortion early in pregnancy, they often figure out a way to make it happen. And so the Republican Party has become so radical on this issue that it has helped the Democratic Party win elections. I still think it underscores the Democratic Party's problem on these issues. Because yes, abortion seemed to help the Democrats in a bunch of close races in 2022. Yes, when you put abortion itself on the ballot, it wins. However, the Democrats basically can't win any statewide elections in about 20 states, including states that Democrats thought would now be at least purple, like Florida and Texas and North Carolina. And in 2022, Democrats ran really hard on don't vote for this Republican because in the new world, this Republican will deny abortion access. And they defeated none of those Republicans. There were no Republicans in North Carolina or Florida or Texas. And these are people who have control over policy. Defeating these Republicans would meaningfully increase reproductive rights access in these states. And abortion was not big enough to flip any of those seats. Abortion seems to have been helpful in close races in places where Joe Biden won, but it wasn't big enough to flip any truly red seats. And I think that's because when a lot of voters look at this, they say, wait a second, the Republican Party is out of what I want on abortion, but the Democratic Party is out of what I want on immigration and on these other issues, and I'm not going to be a single issue voter. I will happily come back and say I was wrong about abortion if it starts to turn Texas and Florida and North Carolina and Iowa and Ohio purple.
We shall see.
Yes.
Look at state Supreme Court
elections.
elections.
But that was effectively an abortion election,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
It wasn't.
I understand your point, and I'm cutting you off only to get to questions. Good. I want to, before we get to questions, and by the way, I'm going to get in trouble with Brad if I don't remind you, if you want to ask a question, and we're going to have one more topic before the questions, please come to the microphone and ask the question so people can hear you, not just here, but who are the hordes of them who will be watching online. I want to talk about immigration because it's really one of the most thought-provoking and perhaps even just provoking issues that you raise. And you say, immigration tends to impose costs on lower-wage workers. For anyone who believes in reducing economic equality in the United States, reducing immigration would probably make the task easier. I want to ask you about that, but I also want to say, I wonder if that is the reason that people are truly the reason that people are riled up about border security, or if there's something really more fundamental going on here, because it doesn't necessarily feel to me like people who are watching immigrants pour across the border are necessarily worried that they're taking jobs from them as much as they are worried in the same way that people are worried when they see shoplifting go unpunished in cities, that there's a sense of a lack of playing by rules, a lack of order, and just a basic failure to control the fundamental levers of society more than economic self-interest at heart. So tell me if I'm right or wrong, and expand on your argument about immigration.
I don't think it's mostly economic self-interest. And I love, Ruth, I love these questions. We'll have to redo this in Red America, where you asked me to talk about all the critical things I say about the Republican Party. It's good.
Yes. He says, by the way, he says extremely nice things, not just about Dwight Eisenhower, but about Richard Nixon.
Well, mixed on Nixon, yes. Less of a hero than A. Philip Randolph. Although I did come home one day and say to my wife, I'm worried that I'm getting too close to my characters because I now see that Richard Nixon has some positive qualities. Immigration. I think immigration, look, I don't think it's mostly about economics. Large-scale immigration is popular nowhere in the world. Nowhere. Japan and South Korea have incredibly restrictive immigration policies. Large amounts of immigration in Europe has helped elect basically neo-fascist candidates. Most working class people in particular do not want massive increases in immigration. And I think that's understandable, right? People care about some level of stability in their countries. It's not simply people of one race who are against large-scale immigration. It's really a global phenomenon. And the main thing...
There may be some racial components to it.
As I said before, there often is racism as part of it, yeah. So I think, look, the Immigration Bill of 1965 is a phenomenal civil rights achievement. Before 1965, for decades in this country, we had an immigration system that basically let in people from Ireland and England and a couple other parts of Northern Europe, and it kept out all essentially Southern Europeans. This is starting in the 20s, Eastern Europeans, Asians, Africans, disabled people. It was an absolutely horrible system. And John F. Kennedy first, and then after he was killed, his brothers and LBJ picked up the mantle, and Emanuel Seller in the House picked up the mantle of immigration reform. And they made two promises when they were pushing immigration reform, and this is the story that I tell in my book. One, we are going to get rid of this racist immigration system, and we are going to treat everyone who comes from anywhere in the world the same. And I think that is just a phenomenal achievement. It really is part of the civil rights legacy of the 1960s. The second promise they made, and I quote them at length, is they said, we will not fundamentally alter the level of immigration in this country. We are not significantly increasing the amount of immigration. LBJ said it when signing the bill. Ted Kennedy said that anyone who claims otherwise was speaking outside of the bounds of respectable dialogue in America, and they should not be given a hearing. LBJ's labor secretary promised complete protection from any labor competition. I mean, the quotes go on and on and on, and they were all wrong. They were all wrong. Immigration started rising almost immediately after the bill passed because of various loopholes that they were dismissive of. It's probably the largest immigration wave in human history, just based on the numbers. And I think it's important to grapple with the fact that it is both a monumental human rights achievement and it's a failure of democracy, because it was sold to the American public on false pretenses. I don't think they were lying. I think they believed it. I just don't think they were thinking about it that closely. I think they were engaged in motivated reasoning. And so I promise I won't tell the whole immigration chapter. We want to get to your questions. But my plea to people is, let's not make the same mistake they did. Let's not wish away evidence that is difficult. Let's not pretend that immigration has no trade-offs. I actually think the economic trade-offs are real. I think they're modest. I think they mostly apply to working class people. I think they'd be easy enough to overcome through tax policy. I think the political trade-offs are much bigger, and I think it is much harder in a society to basically have a progressive society with redistribution when you also have high levels of immigration that feel uncontrolled to the population. And I don't think it's an accident that the decades where we had the biggest gains for progressive policy were also the decades where we had the lowest levels of immigration in this country. And so I just think it's worth not looking at the evidence wishfully and instead saying, what are the upsides and downsides of our current immigration policy? And there is a long line of progressive figures, civil rights figures. I mentioned A. Philip Randolph, he's one of them, Barbara Jordan, Samuel Gompers, progressives who basically said, Bernie Sanders used to talk this way, Barack Obama used to talk this way, who basically said, hey, you know who wants really high levels of immigration? CEOs, Milton Friedman. And I'm uncomfortable with pretending that immigration doesn't have downsides for the most vulnerable members of our society, including immigrants who are already here.
This is why you need to read the book. Let's get to some questions. Thank you for coming to the mic.
Well, that was all very interesting. That's the book I would like to write. I'm a charter member of the elite Brahmins or Brahmin elite or whoever. I was a classmate of Hillary's at Yale Law School. I was born in the 1940s. And so I lived through this rise and fall of that you're talking about. And you haven't mentioned corporations and business at all. Yes, you say standards of living are up, but on the other hand, it takes 2 salaries or 2 incomes to support the American dream, when in the 1950s and 60s it took only 1. One job was enough to support a house, a wife at home, so childcare, public education, a job with health benefits, pensions, time off, sick leave. That you could do that all with one factory job in 1950 and 1960, and that was because of unions, as you say. But the thing I can't figure out, even though I'm part of it, is what happened to us. The New Deal, which you only mentioned in passing, that's Bernie Sanders. That's what we all thought in the 50s and the 60s. All of us Democrats, I'm from Massachusetts, so it's a little bit of a bias. But we had Republicans, governors and senators.
Can I get you to the question? I just want
So
to
the
make sure
question
there's
is,
time
do
for
you
others.
talk about the deep state, which is the corporate state and owns Congress, and our complete failure of election finance reform?
I don't think companies are the deep state, and I think that look, there's still no system that has demonstrated a better record of lifting people's living standards than capitalism. It's just a certain form of capitalism, right? It needs to be capitalism with the rough edges taken off.
Right.
And I actually spend a lot of time on corporations in the book. And one of the things that I lament is that there did used to be a less selfish and more patriotic and more communitarian culture in corporate America. And we can't just get that back by wishing for it. But I tell the story of George and Mitt Romney, who,
Right.
although I disagree
Exactly.
with Mitt Romney on many issues, I think he's a deeply honorable public servant, and I think George Romney was an honorable public servant. They also grew up in a very different corporate culture. George Romney voluntarily returned a bonus that he was due at his car company that he was the CEO of because he thought it was unseemly to make so much more money than his workers. Mitt Romney never voluntarily returned a bonus at Bain Capital. And I don't mean that as a criticism of Mitt Romney. It just wasn't in the culture of the world that he was in, and it was in George Romney's culture. In George Romney's culture, CEOs didn't try to make every last dollar that they could have. They could have pushed to make much more. And so in ways that I think are hard to figure out how to get back to it, I do think we used to have a more community-focused and more patriotic corporate culture. Thank you.
Thanks.
I would contend that the shift of the American economy from a manufacturing agricultural economy to primarily a service economy has affected both the reality and the perception of changes in real income. Because in a service economy like we have today, there are some jobs in which it's much more difficult to generate increases in productivity and therefore in the ability to pay higher real wages than there were in the days of when we were a manufacturing and agricultural economy, and when there were very real, very dramatic opportunities for improvements in productivity per employee. And the second thing that's happened with the advent of the service economy is that many of the improvements in the quality of service we get from service functions are not recorded in either the GNP. So my question is, do you delve into the complexities of the service economy and how that has affected both the ability for us to generate higher real incomes and the perception that people are no better off when in fact their services they're receiving are considerably better than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess there are two things in there. I really do think that I trust Americans, and I think there's all kinds of evidence that their living standards have not risen as rapidly as they would like. I don't think it's the case that Americans are wrong and everything's just sort of hunky-dory and they should just cheer up a little bit. And I think one of the reasons for that, and this was related to the service sector and the manufacturing sector, is inequality has increased so much over the last few decades. That is not inevitable. Whether we had a manufacturing economy or a service economy, we don't have to have an economy with inequality as high as we have. It is possible to have a service economy with lower inequality than we have today. And we've basically chosen to have an economy, I don't think all of us have individually chosen it, to have an economy where a huge portion of the gains of economic growth over the last 50 years have gone to a very small slice of people.
Let's get quickly to questions so we can
Yes,
get to most of the folks
this
in
is a
line.
question, but it was very interesting interview, and I look forward to reading the book as much
Thank
as our household looks forward to reading your daily columns.
Thank you.
But the elephant in the room, I'm sure it's in the book, is the discussion of campaign contributions in terms of how it affects policy, particularly, let's say, in regard to the difference between campaign promises or election eve speeches with regard to the various presidents you mentioned who and members of Congress, and I worked in Congress for many years, do have in mind and do try and push all the things you talked about that could help.
I mean, I think campaign finance reform is important. Ruth knows more about it than I do. I don't think it is the key that unlocks all of our problems. I think it could make a difference, but I think at the end of the day, a lot of the changes that we need, we can still accomplish through the political system that we have. I mean, Ruth questioned my optimism at the end. The only thing I would remind people of is 25 years ago, could any of us imagine that same-sex marriage would become legal as quickly as it became legal? Rapid change in this country really is possible when people put together political movements that win over Americans, often making kind of culturally moderate or even conservative arguments, which the marriage equality movement was fantastically savvy about doing. And so I really do think it's possible to have political movements that can change our economy without campaign finance reform. I also think campaign finance reform would make it much easier.
Hey, David. Apologies for not looking at the footnotes, but Michael Lynn's New Class War, politically right of center, talks. His Venn diagram would be Republicans, Democrats, and the technocratic elite. And without having read the book, how much are the Bezoses, Musks, Gates, all who run non-union shops, who have actually helped destroy that American dream that you talk about? How hard do you hit that elite group and their business models?
So I think I probably hit the concept of the elite pretty hard. Ruth started really nicely by asking a little bit about the process of writing the book. And I read all or parts of, 100 books to write this book. And I had the same experience again and again. I'm not going to name any of the books, but where I'd be reading a book written in 1960. And I'd be thinking, oh my goodness, this is an amazing book. It's so good and so wise, and I'm learning so much. And then I'd get to the parts about the 1950s, and I'd be like, that didn't age so well. It's really hard to make judgments about the last 10 or 20 years in a way that last. And so I don't think any of the moguls you mentioned, including both the one that Ruth works for and the ones she doesn't work for, are in the book. But I think the idea that we have an elite that is less connected to this country, I think it's important to say that is less patriotic than the corporate elite we used to have, I think is a big part of what's going on. I just don't think we're going to get back to that kind of broad-minded elite simply by asking nicely. And one of the reasons we got the elite of the mid-century years that we got was because of the strength of the labor movement, and basically forced companies to understand that they needed to work with labor unions. They could push back against them, but they needed to work with them. And the other thing is, a lot of the corporate elite were terrified of the Depression and of the possibility of losing World War II and of communism. And I think that, I do think fear is a big motivating factor and can lead to a more patriotic communitarian elite. The thing is, it's a little bit hard to root for things that would cause fear.
Is it realistic to expect any one country to stay at the top? Because books like The Rise and Fall of Nations, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers says it's inevitable. So are we looking for something which doesn't really exist in terms of looking for factors that's going to just keep one country or one group of people always at the top?
I think that's a really important point. The United States is never going to keep its level of dominance in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when Japan and Western Europe, I mean, at least the beginning of that period, were still recovering from war. The Southern Hemisphere, parts of it, were still in the midst of colonialism or emerging from it. Russia and China were living under communism, which doesn't work very well. And so we're not going to get back to that point. But I guess I would say two things. One, I don't think that our relative decline needs to be as rapid as it's been recently. I think we can make better decisions. And I think that you can see that we can make better decisions by the fact that so much of our growth has gone to the very top, right? We could have more of our growth being more broadly shared. And the other thing I would say, and I know this is like a patriotism is a little bit out of fashion, look around the world today. I think we really should want a strong America in the world, because the rising countries that are coming up to challenge us, they're not liberal democracies, right? That's not what we're looking at. And a world in which China sets the rules or Russia sets the rules strikes me as a much scarier world to live in than one in which we are able to, if not retain the dominance we had, at least retain a large amount of our power.
As a corollary to that, people argue that immigration is something that actually gave the technological advancement and actually gave the rise in the last 2 decades, and that therefore immigration is very important, whether it's to Silicon Valley or to all the tech. So what do you say?
Immigration is very important. I just think we should have an honest democratic conversation about what kind of immigration policy we're going to have, as opposed to what we've had over the last 60 years is a huge increase in immigration that was sold as the exact opposite, and now an immigration system in which laws are just not that important, right? And so I think it's really important that we have an immigration system that feels like part of our democratic system.
Very quickly, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I want to build a parallel argument. Mass immigration has ended the period of progressive legislation, the period of strong labor unions, as a component, mass immigration. A higher percentage of, in our GDP, of international trade, where we've offshored manufacturing to China, has done the same thing. So immigration and international trade are on parallel courses. And so my question to you is, do you welcome the drift toward autarky? I mean, it's a minor drift, but we have a little bit of a drift because companies are afraid of supply chain problems and because everybody's afraid of China. And so we have this drift which is going to lower our GDP, but it's going to decrease our inequality. So do you welcome it?
Yeah, I know. I welcome Joe Biden taking a more skeptical attitude toward trade than, I mean, you could argue it's not more skeptical than Trump, but Trump's rhetoric and his policies are just such an incoherent mess that it's a little bit hard to figure out. But Joe Biden has taken a more skeptical attitude toward trade than any Democratic president, and I think that's warranted. I mean, I talked about the promises that the Reagan administration and its allies made about the economy. Go back and look at the promises that presidents of both parties made about trade. They said it will make America much richer and it will make China freer. Those promises have not aged very well. When you look at the economic research on what the huge increase in of trade with China has done to many communities, how it's hollowed out those communities, this paper called The China Shock by David Autor of MIT and others, if you want to see it. And so I do welcome a world in which, instead of just saying that the famous Washington neoliberal consensus has to be right because it looked good on a blackboard, and that people are now paying more attention to the real world effects that some of these policies have had. And you do have more skepticism about this idea of a world without borders in our politics. I do welcome that.
Do we have time for one more, Brad? Two more people.
Two more. Okay, I'll make very quick.
This man has a mean pickleball serve.
Oh my God! Thanks. Thank you for that introduction. Okay, so two quick questions. Okay, one is you talk about I haven't seen any mention of globalization here, right? I mean, I know the previous lady asked a question about the fact that America can't always be the top, but the reality is that colonization affected most of the world, and people are coming out of the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Consider India and China and all those countries, right? So they were. At one point, India was, 28% of the world's GDP, right? 16th century, 17th century.
Yeah, century.
Right. So there is a natural effect because the fact that they were all subjugated and they were exploited, right? Never happened. So now, you're going to see globalization also as a reason, is one of the reasons for globalization is because of the after effects of colonization going away, right? Slowly, number one. The second question, I'm going to make it very quick. You talked about labor unions, right? I mean, I'm an innovator. And I always see that whether the auto industry or not, just as auto industry had the chance to create the EV car in the 1990s, they had all the policy supporting them. California said 1991, you create an EV car. They never could because they didn't want to, right? Innovation was never the DNA. It was not about, okay, let's make the world better. It's about how much money can I make in the pocket, right? So unions do actually regress the amount of innovation that can happen. Right, those are 2 points, quick points.
Yep. So just, I think I agree about globalization. I think globalization clearly has pluses and minuses. I think it's interesting that you mentioned India as being a past power. I think it's very hard to be hopeful about China's role in the world today. I just think it's very, very difficult. Is there some world in which things turn around in China and it becomes a force for freedom and a force for the best values that liberal democracies? Sure. It's much easier to imagine India playing that role, right? And this is not core to my book, but I think if you want to think about ways in which you could actually have a world that is freer, and I understand there are deep reasons to worry about what's going on in India today, but if you want to think about a world where basically liberal democratic values like equality are celebrated, and you say, what does that likely look like over the next 50 years? I think part of it looks like the United States arresting its relative decline, and part of it looks like rising powers embracing some of those values. There's no better, it's not guaranteed, but there's no country that has a better chance of both being a rising power and embracing some of those values as India. On labor unions, look, I agree labor unions can be a blockage of innovation. I've seen it at my own company. I just would say, let's look at the economy of the early 20th century. Let's look at the economy of the last 40 years where labor unions have very little power. That's not an economy that works particularly well for most people.
True. The first question, Hilary, quick one.
No, let's
All right, fine, go ahead.
I have a simple point to make. I'm from Scandinavia.
Yeah.
And I think it's really, really expensive to live in the United States. So
Even
one
more
thing
expensive
is
than Scandinavia.
Yeah, it actually is. And one thing is income inequality. Other thing is the cost of living. I'm trying to raise a teenager between the U.S. and Norway. His dad's American. We move back and forth, So I basically have a question about the cost of living and especially the cost of education. And how important do you think that is for the point that you're making?
Yeah. That's chapter 10. And actually, Sweden plays a role in it because of some of the important work that Sweden did on gender equality. I think education is vital. I've talked a lot about labor unions tonight, but I think education probably belongs on the list, a very similar point, right? And I think the United States, for many decades, even going back to the late 19th century, Ruth mentioned Willa Cather. She's in chapter 10. The United States embraced this model of mass education when the rest of the world didn't. Europe basically said, why do workers need to learn how to read great literature? They're just going to be workers. And we said, no, we're going to send our workers to high school. And we did. And then starting in the mid-20th century, when England said, maybe we should send our workers to high school, we said, we'll send our workers to college. And we passed the GI Bill. If you are over 60 years old, today, in this room, you're part of the most educated generation in the world. If you are under 40, you are not. And the United States basically developed this incredibly powerful model of mass education. It made blue-collar factories more productive because people could do their job better. It made white-collar employees, both clerks and also high-level people, more productive. It was this amazing model. It reduced inequality. It increased economic growth. It didn't have some of the downsides that I think some skeptics of labor unions think. It's just like a good education is all good. And it makes sense over time, the same way in the 19th century we thought people needed 9 years of education, and then we thought they needed more. It makes sense that that number should rise over time. We abandoned our own beautiful invention of mass education, and other countries took it on, and they've passed us by with education. And a big part of that is because we make it so expensive to get education, whether that's where you have to buy a home in order to afford good schools, or whether it's actually paying for private schools. And I think it's one of the examples of how, in a very basic way, we're letting down people who just want to figure out a way to live a decent life and let their kids live a better life than they did.
We can change that.
Can we change it? We'd have to use the political system to change it. I mean, part of my plea is let's use the political system to focus on lifting the material living standards of ordinary people. We had this huge upsurge of activism to prevent Donald Trump from repealing Obamacare, and it worked. It was like a mini version of the marriage equality movement. It was grassroots activism that changed policy in this country. So I don't know exactly what it looks like, but if you told me we had a surge of grassroots activism to improve education for people, or to make it easier for people to join labor unions, or to end this miserable health system that we have where you got to fill out 400 forms all the time, I think it can work. I think it's really, really hard. I think these movements endure years of defeat before they win, and they're not guaranteed to win. But I think American history, as dark as it is right now, we should be confident that our political system gives us the tools to change the things that are so alarming right now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David and Ruth. David's book is available at the checkout desk. He'll be up